At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, a single mortar shell arced over the dark waters of Charleston Harbor. It traced a glowing trajectory through the pre-dawn sky, aimed at a pentagonal brick fortress on a man-made island. The shell exploded above the parade ground inside Fort Sumter. There was no warning shot. The first round came from a floating battery stationed near James Island. Less than an hour earlier, at 3:20 a.m., 3 Confederate officers had rowed out to the fort under a flag of truce. They delivered a formal demand: evacuate the garrison immediately or face bombardment. The Union commander, Major Robert Anderson, gave a short, firm answer. He would evacuate only when his supplies ran out, and that would not be for days. The officers rowed back. Anderson told his officers to prepare for what was coming. What happened next was not a surprise to anyone who had been watching the crisis unfold over the previous months. But the timing and the specific trigger remain points of debate among historians to this day. The shell that exploded at 4:30 a.m. did not kill anyone. It was a signal round, meant to announce that the bombardment had begun. Within minutes, 43 Confederate guns and mortars ringing the harbor opened fire from every direction. Fort Sumter's walls, 3 feet thick at the base in some places, began to shudder under the impact. Inside, the Union garrison numbered fewer than 100 men. They had 60 pieces of artillery mounted in the fort, but only a fraction were in working order. Anderson ordered his men to hold their fire until daylight. He wanted to conserve ammunition and see where the enemy batteries were placed. The first Union reply came at 7 a.m. when Captain Abner Doubleday aimed a 32-pounder at the Confederate ironclad battery on Cummings Point. The fort's guns were limited in their ability to hit targets at range because many were situated on the upper tier, exposed to enemy fire, and the fort itself was under siege in more ways than one. Supply ships sent from Washington had failed to reach the garrison. The last steamer, the Star of the West, had been turned back by Confederate artillery in January. By April, food was low, ammunition was carefully rationed, and the men were exhausted from working around the clock to prepare defensive positions. The bombardment continued for 34 hours. At times, the fort's walls caught fire. Smoke filled the casemates. The noise was described by one participant as a constant, rolling thunder that never stopped long enough to let a man think. Anderson's men fired back, but their ammunition supply was limited to roughly 700 rounds. They could not afford to waste a single shot. The Confederate gunners, by contrast, had ample powder and shot. They had been stockpiling for weeks. The local militia, volunteer companies from South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, and other states, had taken up positions all along the harbor. They were commanded by Brigadier General Pierre Gustave Toussaint Beauregard, a former West Point classmate of Anderson's. The two men had studied together at the military academy. Now Beauregard was directing the fire that was slowly destroying Anderson's command. By the afternoon of April 13th, the situation inside Fort Sumter was dire. The upper barracks were aflame. The main flagpole had been shot down, but it was quickly replaced. The powder magazine was threatened by sparks and heat. Anderson considered surrendering, but he wanted to wait until he was certain his ammunition was genuinely exhausted. His men were also running out of food. The last rations were distributed on the morning of the 13th. The men had been living on salted pork, hardtack, and coffee for weeks, but now even that was gone. At 1:30 p.m. on April 13th, Anderson finally agreed to terms. A ceasefire was called. The Confederates sent a boat to discuss surrender. The Union garrison would be allowed to evacuate, taking their personal belongings and sidearms, but they would leave the fort's guns and public property behind. At 4 p.m., the national flag was lowered over Fort Sumter. A salute was fired, 100 guns, but the salute was cut short after 50 rounds because of an accidental explosion that killed one Union soldier. That soldier, Private Daniel Ho, became the first casualty of the war, killed not by enemy fire but by his own gun during the surrender ceremony. The evacuation was completed the next morning. Anderson and his men boarded ships sent by the U.S. Navy, which had been waiting outside the harbor. They sailed north to New York, where they arrived as heroes. But the relief was bitter. Fort Sumter had fallen. How could this have happened? The answer lies in a chain of decisions, misjudgments, and political calculations that stretched back months, even years, before the first shot. To understand the fall of Fort Sumter, you have to understand the context of the secession crisis that had gripped the nation since the election of Abraham Lincoln in November 1860. South Carolina had voted to secede from the Union on December 20th, 1860. By February 1861, 7 states had formed the Confederate States of America. Fort Sumter, still held by Union troops, sat in the middle of Charleston Harbor like a splinter in the palm of the new nation. It was a symbol of federal authority in a place that no longer recognized that authority. For months, negotiations had gone nowhere. The old administration of President James Buchanan had tried to avoid conflict, sending mixed signals to both sides. The new administration under Lincoln was determined not to give up the fort, but also not to start a war. Lincoln announced he would send provisions to the starving garrison, but not reinforcements, unless the Confederates attacked. This was a calculated move. If the Confederates fired on a supply ship, they would be the aggressors. But the Confederates saw the resupply attempt as an act of war. Beauregard was ordered to demand the fort's surrender before Lincoln's ships arrived. When Anderson refused, the bombardment began. The system that failed was not a single piece of machinery or a policy. It was a political system that could not reconcile the deep divisions over slavery and states' rights. The military command structure was also strained. Major Anderson was caught between his orders from Washington and the reality of his isolated position. He had been told not to provoke a conflict, but he also had to defend his post. He moved his garrison from the vulnerable Fort Moultrie on the mainland to the more defensible Fort Sumter on December 26, 1860. That move was seen by South Carolina as a breach of a promise not to change the status quo. But Anderson felt he was protecting his men. In the end, the only thing that could have prevented the fall of the fort would have been a political agreement that was never reached, and the consequences of that failure were enormous. Why does the fall of Fort Sumter still matter? Because it was the opening act of a war that would kill more than 600,000 Americans. It marked the moment when words turned into bullets, when the debate over secession became a question decided by artillery. The fort itself became a shrine. For the North, it was a rallying cry. The phrase, "Remember Fort Sumter," appeared on banners and in newspapers across the Union. For the South, it was a triumph, a validation of the cause. That triumph proved to be short-lived. The war consumed everything. The facts of the bombardment are not in dispute, but historians continue to debate the what-ifs. What if Lincoln had withdrawn the garrison altogether? What if Anderson had surrendered sooner? What if the relief expedition had arrived before the Confederates opened fire? These questions are not just academic. They reveal the fragility of the situation, how a single decision could have changed the course of the war. The fall of Fort Sumter set in motion a chain of events that could not be stopped. One less understood aspect is the role of the steamer Baltic, which carried the supplies from New York. It arrived off Charleston Harbor on April 12th, just hours after the bombardment had begun. The Navy had to turn back. The ships were powerless to intervene. The sight of the fort being shelled from a distance must have been agonizing for the sailors and the relief supplies that sat uselessly in the hold. That failure of coordination, the timing of the relief effort, remains a painful memory. The human consequences were felt immediately. The Union soldiers who evacuated were not injured, but they were humiliated. They had lost their post without a real fight, trapped by a siege they could not break. Anderson himself was deeply affected. He later returned to the fort in 1865 to raise the same flag he had lowered in 1860. That ceremony was one of the high points of the Union victory, but even then, the scars were there. On the Confederate side, the victory was celebrated with parades and speeches. Beauregard became a household name. It seemed like a quick, almost bloodless triumph. The only casualty of the bombardment itself was accidental, a horse killed by a stray shell. But the hollowness of that victory became apparent later. Fort Sumter was not the end of a conflict. It was the beginning of a conflict that would devour the young men who cheered that morning. The investigation into the events, if it can be called an investigation, was conducted by the U.S. Congress and the War Department. They asked why the fort was not better prepared, why the relief expedition was delayed, and why Anderson had not been given clearer instructions. The answers were muddled. Blame was spread across the Buchanan administration, the Navy, and even Anderson himself, though he was largely exonerated. The deeper questions about the political roots of the crisis were never fully addressed because the war itself overtook everything. What failed was not a pilot or a door lock or a medical check. It was the entire framework of compromise and negotiation that had held the Union together for decades. The system of checks and balances, the fragile peace between slave states and free states, the Supreme Court decisions, the fugitive slave laws, the endless debates in Congress, all of it collapsed in the smoke of that first mortar shell. The fall of Fort Sumter is now remembered as a moment of national tragedy, but at the time it was celebrated or mourned depending on which side you stood. The fort itself still stands in Charleston Harbor. It is a national monument. Visitors walk through the same casemates where Anderson's men slept on sandbags and ate their last biscuits. They look out at the water where the Confederate batteries once stood. The walls still bear the scars of the bombardment. It is a quiet place now, but the history is loud. The story of Fort Sumter is not just about a fort. It is about the decision to pull a trigger, to light a fuse, to send a shell into the darkness. And how that one action, taken by men who thought they were acting with justification, spiraled into a war that no one fully predicted. The first shots of the Civil War were not accidental. They were the result of a long, deliberate buildup of tension. When the tension broke, the country broke with it. On the morning of April 12, 1861, at 4:30 a.m., a single mortar shell arced over Charleston Harbor. It was fired from Fort Johnson on James Island. The officer who gave the order was Captain George S. James. The gun crew lit the fuse. The shell traced a glowing parabola in the darkness before dawn. It burst directly over Fort Sumter. That shell was the signal. It told all other Confederate batteries to open fire. Within seconds, the harbor erupted. Fort Moultrie, now in Confederate hands, opened with its columbiads. Fort Cummings, Fort Gregg, and the floating battery near Sullivan's Island joined in. The ironclad battery at Cummings Point, reinforced with railway iron, fired heated shot directly at Sumter's western wall. The bombardment was not random. Every battery had a designated target. The aiming points had been surveyed for weeks. The gunners knew the range and the bearing. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson had about 85 men. His garrison included soldiers from the 1st U.S. Artillery, plus a few engineers and musicians. They had 60 guns mounted, but many were positioned on the upper tier, exposed to enemy fire. Anderson ordered his men to conserve ammunition. He intended to use only the lower tier of casemate guns, which were safer but less powerful. He did not want to provoke a full-scale battle. He did not want to start a war. That restraint cost him. The Confederates fired relentlessly. The first shell hit the fort's flagpole. The flag itself was not damaged, but the pole was weakened. Anderson's men rigged a makeshift pole using a spar from the wharf. They raised the flag again. Inside, the barracks began to burn. The wooden roofs caught fire from heated shot. The flames spread to the storerooms where spare ammunition was kept. Anderson's men had to throw barrels of powder into the water to prevent an explosion. By noon, the fort was heavily damaged. The walls were chipped and pitted. The interior was filled with smoke. The men worked in shifts, firing back when they could, but they were outgunned. The Confederate batteries fired roughly 4,000 rounds during the 36-hour bombardment. The Union garrison returned only about 1,000. Anderson had ordered his gunners to aim for the Confederate batteries, not the city, to avoid civilian casualties. That decision was not purely humanitarian. It was also tactical. Anderson knew his supplies were low. He was waiting for the relief expedition. He hoped that by not escalating, the Confederates might hold back, but the Confederates did not hold back. By the afternoon of April 12th, the fort was untenable. The fire had spread to the main gate. The magazine where the remaining powder was stored was threatened. Anderson ordered the men to close the magazine doors and seal them with sandbags. At 1 p.m. on April 13th, Anderson's officers held a council. The situation was grim. The fort was burning. The ammunition was nearly gone. The men had not slept in more than 30 hours. They had eaten only cold rations. The water supply was contaminated. Anderson sent a message to Beauregard offering to evacuate if he could fire a salute to the flag. Beauregard agreed. The terms of surrender were negotiated. The ceremony began at 4 p.m. on April 13th. Anderson's men lowered the stars and stripes for the last time. They were allowed to take their small arms and personal belongings. They marched out of the fort with their colors still flying. The flag was carefully packed away. Anderson did not want it to be captured. As they left, the Confederates on shore cheered. But the story of the bombardment is not just about strategy and ammunition. It is about the people inside. One of them was Private John L. H. Anderson, no relation to the major. He was a young man from Pennsylvania. He had joined the Army 2 years earlier. He kept a diary. His entry for April 12th reads, "A heavy cannonading commenced from all the batteries. The balls and shells flew thick around us. We returned the fire. The men are cool and determined." He survived the bombardment and returned north. He later fought at Antietam and Gettysburg. He was wounded twice. Another soldier was Sergeant James O. O'Connor. He was an Irish immigrant who had served in the British Army before coming to America. He was known for his steady nerve. During the bombardment, a shell entered the casemate where he was standing. It rolled across the floor. O'Connor picked it up and threw it out the embrasure before it exploded. That action saved several men. He later received a commendation. The garrison also included several civilian workers. They were mostly laborers and carpenters hired to repair the fort. They had no military training. When the shells started falling, they hid in the magazines. Anderson had to order them to help with the firefighting. Some of them later testified to Congress about the conditions inside. One of them, a man named William G. H. Morrison, said, "The men had no food but salt pork and hard bread. The water was warm and tasted of smoke. We were all sick." Morrison lived to be 80 years old. He never returned to Charleston. What happened after the surrender? Anderson and his men were taken by ship to Union lines. They arrived in New York on April 21st. The city held a massive parade in their honor. Anderson was promoted to brigadier general. He toured the North, speaking at recruiting rallies. He carried the flag from Fort Sumter with him. It became a symbol of defiance. In the South, the fall of Fort Sumter was seen as a validation of secession. Crowds gathered in Charleston to celebrate. Beauregard was hailed as a hero. The Confederate government in Montgomery issued a statement praising the victory, but there was also unease. Some Southern leaders knew that war had now become inevitable. Robert E. Lee, then still a colonel in the U.S. Army, wrote to a friend, "I see that Fort Sumter has fallen. I fear that the worst is now before us." The investigation into the loss of the fort was conducted by the U.S. Congress starting in May 1860. A joint committee was formed. They interviewed Anderson, his officers, and several witnesses from the Navy. The questions focused on whether the fort could have been reinforced earlier, whether the supply ships should have been sent sooner, and whether Anderson had acted correctly. The testimony was published in a thick volume called Report on the Condition of Fort Sumter. What did they find? They found that the Buchanan administration had delayed sending reinforcements because of political pressure. They found that the Navy had not provided sufficient tugboats to tow the supply ships into the harbor. They found that Anderson had been given ambiguous orders that did not allow him to defend the fort aggressively. The committee concluded that the loss was due to a failure of leadership in Washington, but they did not name names. The war was too new, and no one wanted to appear disloyal. The deeper system failure was not just the fort's design or the supply chain. It was the government itself. In the months before Lincoln's inauguration, the United States had no effective executive. President Buchanan was a lame duck. He believed the secession crisis could be resolved by waiting it out. He did not want to provoke the South. He allowed the Confederates to arm the batteries around the harbor. He allowed the regular army units in the South to surrender without a fight. The rot was institutional. When Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, he inherited a crisis that was already past the point of diplomacy. His decision to send provisions to Sumter was a gamble. He hoped the Confederates would back down. They did not. The system of compromise that had held the Union together for 70 years had worn out. The mechanisms of negotiation, the fragile alliances, the careful balances of power, all collapsed. The fall of Fort Sumter is often taught as the start of the Civil War. But it is also a case study in how small decisions can lead to catastrophic consequences. The decision to put a new fort on a man-made island. The decision to move Anderson's garrison from Moultrie to Sumter. The decision to send a relief expedition without enough firepower. The decision to fire the first shell. Each decision seemed reasonable at the time. Each one narrowed the options until only war remained. The human cost of those decisions did not end with the surrender. The men who fought at Sumter went on to fight in many other battles. The Union soldiers who evacuated were assigned to new regiments. Many died at Bull Run, Shiloh, Fredericksburg. The Confederate gunners who fired the first shots also paid a price. Some were killed later in the war. Some survived to see their homes burned by Sherman's army. Some lived to be old men, haunted by what they had done. One such Confederate was Edmund Ruffin. He was a firebrand secessionist who had been present at the firing of the first shot. He pulled the lanyard for the signal shell, though some accounts dispute that detail. Ruffin was 77 years old at the time. He was a wealthy planter and agricultural reformer. He hated the Union with a savage passion. After the war, he could not accept defeat. He wrote in his diary, "I cannot live under the rule of the Yankees." On June 17, 1865, he wrapped himself in a Confederate flag and shot himself in the head. He was the last casualty of the war in a way, a man who could not survive the world he had helped create. The fort itself remained in Confederate hands for nearly 4 years. It was shelled repeatedly by Union forces. The walls were battered down to half their original height, but the Confederates held on. They repaired the fort with sandbags and earthworks. It was not until the final days of the war, in February 1865, that Charleston was evacuated. Union troops reoccupied Fort Sumter. On April 14, 1865, exactly 4 years after the surrender, Major Anderson returned. He had been promoted to brevet major general. He raised the same flag he had lowered in 1860. It was a triumphant ceremony. But as it happened, President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated later that night in Washington. The news of the flag raising arrived alongside the news of the killing. The nation mourned. The flag from Fort Sumter is now in the Fort Sumter Museum in Charleston Harbor. It is a fragile piece of cloth, faded and torn. It has 33 stars. It was made in 1860. It survived the bombardment, the fire, the years of storage. It is kept behind glass in a climate-controlled case. Visitors can see it. They stand quietly in front of it. They do not cheer. They do not cry. They just look. The fall of Fort Sumter still matters because it reminds us that war rarely begins with a single clear cause. It begins with a series of misunderstandings, miscalculations, and missed opportunities. It begins with leaders who think they can control events but cannot. It begins with ordinary men who do extraordinary things under pressure. And it begins with a moment, a shell in the pre-dawn darkness, that changes everything. In the decades after the war, the story of Fort Sumter was told differently by each side. The North told it as a story of martyrdom and sacrifice. The South told it as a story of principled resistance. Both versions contained some truth and much exaggeration. The reality was more mundane. The fort was a piece of real estate. The men were soldiers doing their duty. The shots were fired by men who were scared and angry and loyal to their cause, but the consequences were anything but mundane. They shaped the future of the nation. Today, Fort Sumter is a national monument. It is administered by the National Park Service. Rangers give tour. They explain the history. They show the cracks in the walls. They point out the ironclad battery on Cummings Point. They talk about the difference between smoothbore cannons and rifled guns. They tell you about the daily life of the garrison. They do not take sides, they let the facts speak, and the facts are still stark. The first shots of the Civil War were not accidental. They were the result of a long, deliberate buildup of tension. And when the tension broke, the country broke with it. The war that followed killed more than 600,000 Americans. It ended slavery. It remade the Constitution. It left scars that have not fully healed. It is a chapter of American history that cannot be closed. In the end, Fort Sumter is not just a place. It is a lesson. The lesson is that peace is fragile, that words matter, that decisions made in one room can echo across generations, that the people who pull the triggers are not monsters. They are neighbors and brothers and sons. They are us. And that is the most uncomfortable truth of all. At 4:30 p.m. on April 13, 1861, the last Union soldiers evacuated Fort Sumter. They boarded the steamer Isabel under a flag of truce. The Confederate officer in charge, Colonel James Chestnut Jr., watched from a nearby boat. He had been one of the commissioners sent by the Confederate government to negotiate with Major Anderson. Now he was witnessing the outcome of those failed talks. The evacuation was orderly. The garrison carried their personal belongings, their weapons, and their wounded. They left behind the fort's flag, which had been shot down during the bombardment and later raised again. Anderson refused to surrender it, but he allowed the Confederates to keep it as a trophy. That flag would become a bitter symbol for the rest of the war. The voyage out of Charleston Harbor took only 90 minutes. The Isabel steamed past Morris Island and Fort Moultrie. Confederate soldiers lined the parapets. They cheered as the Union boat passed. Some waved their hats, others fired their muskets into the air. On board, the men of the garrison sat in silence. One soldier later wrote that he felt a strange emptiness, a kind of hollow in the chest. They were not beaten in battle. They had never surrendered. They had been starved out, and they knew it. The humiliation did not come from the enemy. It came from their own government's failure to resupply them in time. When the Isabel reached the open sea, she met the Union relief fleet. The fleet had arrived 2 days earlier, but it was too late. Commodore Stringham, the naval officer in charge, had anchored his ships well outside the harbor. He had expected to use the tugboats to tow the supply ships in, but the tugboats never arrived. One tug, the Yankee, had been delayed by mechanical problems. Another, the Baltic, was still off the coast of New York. The Navy had not prioritized the mission. Stringham later testified that he believed the harbor was too heavily fortified to attempt a night landing. The decision to wait cost Anderson his last hope. The relief fleet itself told a story of indecision. The ships included the Powhatan, a steam sloop of war, the Pawnee, another sloop, the Harriet Lane, a revenue cutter, and the Baltic, a commercial steamer chartered by the War Department. The Powhatan had been secretly ordered to reinforce Fort Pickens in Florida, not Sumter. That order came from Secretary of State William Seward, acting without Lincoln's full knowledge. The confusion reduced the naval force available for Sumter. When the ships finally arrived off Charleston, they had no plan for a coordinated assault. They waited. The Confederates used that time to strengthen their batteries. The relief expedition became a study in how bureaucracy and miscommunication can cripple military operations. Now the fleet had to take the garrison on board and return to New York. It was a quiet journey. The men slept on deck. They ate cold rations. Anderson stayed in his cabin, writing reports. He wrote to the War Department detailing the evacuation. He wrote to his wife telling her he was safe. He did not write about the guilt he felt, but others saw it. One officer noted that Anderson seemed deeply depressed, as if he had lost something more than a fort. He had lost his hope that war could be avoided. He He had fired the first return shots. He had followed orders to the letter, and still the fort had fallen. The fleet reached New York on April 18, 1861. The city was in turmoil. News of the surrender had spread through the north like wildfire. Crowds gathered at the wharves. They cheered the soldiers as they disembarked. But the cheers were not for the defeat. They were for the men who had held out for so long. The New York Tribune wrote that the garrison had done their duty and done it nobly. Lincoln sent a message of thanks. Anderson was promoted to brigadier general. He became a national hero, but a reluctant one. He gave a speech at a reception in New York. He said, "I am not a hero. I was only obeying orders." The questions about the relief expedition did not go away. Investigators from the War Department and the Navy Department interviewed officers and sailors. They focused on the chain of command. Who gave the order to send the Powhatan to Florida? Who failed to provide tugboats? Who decided the fleet should wait? The answers were never fully made public. The committee's final report, published in 1863, blamed the previous administration. It said that the delays of the Buchanan government were the direct cause of the loss of the fort. That was a convenient conclusion for the Republicans. It protected Lincoln from criticism. But the deeper truth was that the entire federal system had failed, not just one party. In the months after the evacuation, the garrison was reassigned. Anderson took command of the Department of Kentucky. His health declined rapidly. He suffered from heart problems and exhaustion. He retired from active service in October 1863. He died in 1871 at the age of 65. He never spoke publicly about Fort Sumter again. His private letters are filled with regret. He wrote to a friend in 1864, "I wish I had been killed in that fort. Then I would not have to live with the memory." The burden of command weighed heavily on him until the end. The other officers from the garrison had varied fates. Captain Abner Doubleday, the second in command, became a major general in the Union Army. He fought at Antietam and Fredericksburg. He is sometimes credited with inventing baseball, a story that has been largely discredited. He died in 1893. Lieutenant Jefferson C. Davis, a regular Army officer who shared a name with the Confederate president, became a major general as well. He was later involved in a scandal when he killed a fellow officer during a personal dispute. He died in 1879. The enlisted men were dispersed into new regiments. Many died at Shiloh, Gettysburg, and other battles. Their names are recorded in the pension files, but few are remembered individually. The fort itself became a symbol for the Confederacy. The Confederate government ordered a formal inspection of the damage. The walls were heavily cracked. The interior buildings were burned out, but the fort was still defensible. Confederate engineers repaired the walls with layers of sandbags and earth. They added more cannons. They renamed it Fort Sumter, but they left the original flagpole standing. Some insisted on raising the Confederate flag over the ruins. For the next 4 years, the fort served as the anchor of Charleston's defenses. It was bombarded by Union forces dozens of times. The worst was in August 1863, when Union ironclads and land batteries poured fire into the fort for 20 consecutive days. The walls crumbled further, but the Confederate garrison held on. The siege of Charleston became a symbol of Southern defiance. The Union Navy tried to force the harbor multiple times. The most famous attempt was the April 7, 1863, attack by 9 ironclad warships. They were repulsed by the fort's guns. One ship, the Keokuk, was sunk. The failure embarrassed the Union High Command. It also showed that technology could not always overcome fortifications. The ironclads had armor, but the Confederate gunners aimed for their vulnerable spots. The battle proved that Fort Sumter, even in ruins, was still dangerous. The deeper question remained: why did the Union not capture Charleston earlier? The answer was partly political. Lincoln needed to maintain support in the border states. A direct assault on Charleston could have been seen as an act of aggression against civilians. The city was also heavily fortified from the land side. Confederates had built a ring of forts and trenches around it. The Union commander in the region, General Quincy Adams Gilmore, decided to focus on reducing the forts one by one rather than risking a direct assault. The campaign dragged on for 2 years. It was not until February 1865, when Sherman's army approached from the rear, that Charleston was evacuated. When the Confederates left, they tried to destroy Fort Sumter completely. They lit fires in the remaining structures. They spiked the cannons. They fled under the cover of darkness. On February 18, 1865, Union forces entered the city. The mayor surrendered. The following day, a small Union party rode out to Fort Sumter. They found the walls almost level with the ground. The interior was a mound of rubble. A single Confederate flagpole still stood, but the flag was gone. One soldier picked up a piece of brick and pocketed it. The fort was empty. The war was almost over. The raising of the flag on April 14, 1865, was a carefully planned ceremony. Major Anderson returned by special invitation. He was now a brevet major general, but he was frail. He walked with a cane. He stood on the parade ground overlooking the same angles that had been bombarded 4 years earlier. The new flag was made by the same woman who had made the original, a seamstress named Mrs. John L. Flagg. Anderson gave a brief speech. He said, "I am here to restore the flag that was taken down in sorrow. I hope that it will never be lowered again." At 2 minutes past noon, the flag was raised. The crowd cheered. Bands played. The ceremony was broadcast by telegraph across the country. That night, Lincoln was shot at Ford's Theater. The news reached Charleston the next morning. The flag that had been raised in triumph was lowered to half-staff. The tragedy overshadowed the victory. Anderson later wrote to his daughter, "There is no joy left in this celebration. The man who made it possible is gone." Lincoln's assassination had a profound effect on the nation. It also changed how the story of Fort Sumter was told. The fort became not just the beginning of the war, but also a symbol of the peace that followed, a peace that cost the president his life. In the years after the war, Fort Sumter was rebuilt. The United States Army allocated funds for repairs. New concrete walls were poured inside the old brick shell. The fort was garrisoned again during the Spanish-American War and World War I. It was used as a training site for coastal artillery. In the 1910s, it was declared a national monument. The War Department transferred it to the National Park Service in 1948. Today, visitors take a ferry from Charleston. The ride takes 30 minutes. The fort looks peaceful. The grass is green. The cannon are silent. But if you look closely at the walls, you can still see the scars. The controversy over the flag raised in 1865 continued into the 20th century. Some Southerners argued that the restored flag was a symbol of Northern aggression. Others saw it as a symbol of reunion. In the 1960s, the National Park Service added interpretive signs that presented both sides of the story. They were careful not to endorse any particular view. The goal was education, not celebration. That approach has been criticized from both sides, but it remains the official policy. The Park Service wants visitors to think critically about the events. One of the most overlooked aspects of the story is the foreign reaction. The fall of Fort Sumter was watched closely by European powers. Britain and France were interested in the conflict because they relied on Southern cotton for their textile industries. The Confederate government sent diplomats to London and Paris seeking recognition. The shelling of Sumter convinced many Europeans that the South was serious about independence. But the invasion of the North after the First Battle of Bull Run changed the calculus. The war became too risky for foreign intervention. The fall of the fort had set a chain of events that almost drew other nations into the conflict. The cost of the war that began at Sumter was staggering. 620,000 soldiers died. Many more were wounded. The economic cost exceeded $15 billion in 1865 currency. The social cost included the destruction of slavery, but also the dislocation of millions of people. Reconstruction failed to deliver lasting equality. The wounds of the war persisted for generations. Some historians argue that the war never really ended, that its effects are still visible in American politics and culture. The fall of Fort Sumter was the moment when the nation finally broke apart. What could have been done differently? The answer is not simple. If the supply expedition had arrived a month earlier, the fort could have been reinforced. But the political situation in January 1861 was different. Buchanan was still president. He might have resisted sending troops. If Anderson had evacuated the fort in December 1860 after the secession of South Carolina, the war might have been delayed. But Anderson chose to stay. If Lincoln had not insisted on sending provisions, the Confederates might not have attacked. But Lincoln believed he had a constitutional duty to hold federal property. Each decision was reasonable in its context. Together, they led to war. The human story of the men who served at Fort Sumter is often reduced to statistics. There were 127 men in the garrison. They came from 20 different states. Some were immigrants from Ireland and Germany. Others were born in the South. One of them, a private named William H. Sickles, was from New York. He later died in a prisoner of war camp. Another, a private named James E. Slater, was from Pennsylvania. He survived the war and returned to farming. They were ordinary men who found themselves in an extraordinary situation. They did not ask to be part of history, but history came to them. The lesson of Fort Sumter is that peace is not a natural state. It requires constant effort, communication, and compromise. When those things fail, violence fills the gap. The first shot was not the beginning of the war. It was the end of a long failure of leadership. The soldiers who fired that shot did not start the war. They were the instruments of a collision that had been building for decades. The real start of the Civil War was not a cannon. It was a series of missed chances, broken promises, and stubborn beliefs. And that is why the story still matters. It reminds us that the decisions we make today can echo for centuries. On the morning of April 14, 1861, at 7 o'clock, Major Robert Anderson stood on the deck of the steamer Baltic. Behind him, Fort Sumter was now under Confederate control, the stars and bars flying over its battered walls. The journey back to New York would take 2 days. Anderson carried with him the tattered garrison flag, carefully folded. He had orders to report to the War Department. The nation was already mobilizing. 3 days earlier, President Lincoln had issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. The response was immediate. In the North, recruiting offices opened overnight. Crowds gathered in city squares. Bands played patriotic songs. The war that had been feared for decades had finally arrived. But the reaction in the border states was more complicated. Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had not yet seceded. They watched the fall of Sumter with alarm. Lincoln's call for troops forced them to choose. A state could not remain neutral when asked to provide soldiers to invade a neighboring state. On April 17th, Virginia seceded. The convention voted by a narrow margin, but the decision was irreversible. Richmond became the new Confederate capital. The war had gained a geographic center. North Carolina followed on May 20th. Tennessee on June 8th. Arkansas on May 6th. The Confederacy now included 11 states. The 4 border states of Maryland, Delaware, Kentucky, and Missouri remained in the Union, but only by fragile margins. In Baltimore on April 19th, a mob attacked Union soldiers passing through the city. 4 soldiers and 12 civilians were killed. Maryland was placed under martial law. The railroad lines were secured at bayonet point. The capital, Washington, was nearly cut off. What happened in those weeks after Sumter was a cascade of decisions, each one narrowing the path to peace. The Confederates had hoped that capturing the fort would force the North to accept secession. Instead, it hardened Northern resolve. Lincoln's call for volunteers was legal under an 1795 militia law, but its constitutionality was questioned. Congress was not in session. Lincoln acted alone. That single act transformed a local confrontation into a national war. The garrison at Sumter had been the trigger, but the powder had been laid for decades. The deeper question was whether the attack could have been avoided. The answer rests on the decisions made in the weeks before the first shot. On January 5, 1861, a small steamer called the Star of the West was sent from New York to reinforce Fort Sumter. It was a secret mission. The ship carried 200 soldiers and supplies. It was meant to slip into Charleston Harbor under the cover of darkness, but the Confederates had spies in Washington. They knew the ship was coming. On January 9th at 6:30 in the morning, the Star of the West approached the harbor entrance. Cadets from the Citadel, manning a battery on Morris Island, fired warning shots. Then they aimed directly at the ship. A shell passed over the bow. Another struck the hull near the waterline. The captain, John McGowan, ordered the ship to turn back. Anderson, watching from inside the fort, had wanted to return fire. He had his men ready, but he had no orders to start a war. He held his fire. The mission failed. That was the first missed chance. If the ship had arrived a week earlier, before South Carolina had fully organized its defenses, the fort might have been reinforced. But the Navy Department delayed. The bureaucracy moved too slowly. Another missed signal came from the Confederate peace commissioners who traveled to Washington in March 1860. They met with Secretary of State William Seward, who gave them unofficial assurances that Fort Sumter would be evacuated. Seward was acting without Lincoln's knowledge. He believed that a peaceful separation was better than war, but Lincoln overruled him. The commissioners returned to the South convinced that the Union was bluffing. They reported that the fort would be abandoned. When the relief expedition was announced, the Confederate leadership felt betrayed. That sense of deception stiffened their resolve to attack. How could the communication between these two sides have been so broken? The telegraph was in use, but messages were often delayed or misinterpreted. The postal service was still functioning, but letters took days. Personal meetings were rare. The two sides spoke different political languages. The North used the language of the Constitution and Union. The South used the language of states' rights and sovereignty. There was no neutral mediator. No international body offered to broker a peace. The crisis unfolded in a vacuum of trust. Each side assumed the worst about the other. The human cost of that failure is measured not only in the casualties of the war, but in the lives lost before the first battle. In the weeks after Sumter, a wave of mob violence swept through the North and South. In Boston, a crowd attacked a Southern sympathizer. In New Orleans, Unionists were tarred and feathered. In St. Louis, a Union regiment fired into a crowd of civilians, killing 28. The war had not yet been declared, but the blood was already being spilled. The first official battle, Bull Run, would come on July 21st, but the unofficial war began the moment the first mortar round hit Sumter. By the summer of 1861, both sides were raising massive armies. In the North, volunteers flocked to the colors. In the South, men enlisted for 3 years or the duration of the war. The supply of weapons was inadequate. Many soldiers drilled with wooden muskets. Uniforms were improvised. The medical system was primitive. Nobody knew how long the war would last. Most believed it would be over by Christmas. They were wrong. The fall of Fort Sumter also had a profound effect on the international stage. On May 13, 1861, Queen Victoria issued a proclamation of neutrality. This recognized the Confederacy as a belligerent power. It was not diplomatic recognition, but it allowed Confederate ships to use British ports. The Union was furious. The proclamation was seen as a hostile act. The Confederate government sent diplomats, James Mason and John Slidell, to Europe to seek full recognition. On November 8, 1861, a Union warship stopped the British mail steamer RMS Trent and removed the 2 diplomats. The British government demanded their release. War nearly broke out between the United States and Great Britain. The crisis was resolved when Lincoln released the diplomats, but the incident showed how close the world had come to being drawn into the American conflict. The spark at Sumter had the potential to ignite a global war. Inside Fort Sumter, the Confederate garrison settled in for a long occupation. The fort was now a symbol of Southern independence, but maintaining it was difficult. The walls had been damaged by the bombardment. The parade ground was littered with debris. The Confederates repaired the fort as best they could. They mounted new cannons facing the sea. They built bomb-proof shelters inside the casemates. The fort became a prison for captured Union soldiers later in the war. Conditions were harsh. Food was scarce. Disease spread quickly. The dead were buried in shallow graves on nearby islands. The Union blockade of Charleston began in May 1860. The USS Niagara and other warships took positions outside the harbor. But the shallow waters and the powerful Confederate batteries made a close blockade dangerous. The blockade runners continued to slip through under cover of darkness. Charleston remained a major port for the Confederacy until 1863. The fall of the city was not assured. In June 1862, the Union launched an amphibious assault on James Island, south of Charleston. The Battle of Secessionville was a Confederate victory. The Union forces were repulsed with heavy losses. That failure convinced the Union command that a direct assault on Charleston was too risky. Instead, they decided to reduce the harbor defenses methodically. That strategy led to the siege of Fort Sumter in 1863. By mid-1863, the Union had built new rifled cannons that could fire from longer ranges. General Quincy Adams Gilmore arrived with a plan. On July 10, 1863, Union troops landed on Morris Island, the same island where the first shot had been fired. They pushed the Confederates back. By August, they had established batteries within range of Fort Sumter. On August 17th at dawn, the bombardment began. The new guns fired solid shot and explosive shells. The bricks of Fort Sumter crumbled under the impact. The outer walls were reduced from 40 feet thick to less than 10 feet in places. The interior was a ruin, but the Confederate garrison refused to surrender. They moved into the casemates and lived among the rubble. They continued to return fire with whatever guns remained intact. The siege lasted for months. On September 8, 1863, the Union launched a nighttime boat assault on Fort Sumter. They hoped to take the fort by surprise. But the Confederates had learned from the first attack. They had stationed sharpshooters on the walls. The Union boats were detected in the darkness. The Confederates opened fire. The assault failed. Union losses were heavy. The fort remained in Confederate hands. The deeper lesson of the siege was that a determined defender could hold a position even when it appeared destroyed. The Confederates were willing to die for the symbol of Sumter. The Union was unwilling to pay the price to take it. That stalemate continued until 1865. In February 1865, the Confederate forces in Charleston were ordered to evacuate. Sherman's army was approaching from the south. The city was no longer defensible. On February 17th at 10 o'clock at night, the Confederates set fire to the remaining supplies. They spiked the cannons. They left Fort Sumter through the Sally Port, rowing away in small boats. The next morning, Union troops entered the city. The mayor surrendered. On February 18th, a Union party rode out to Sumter. They found the fort completely abandoned. The walls were nearly level with the ground. Only one flagpole remained standing, but the flag was gone. One soldier picked up a piece of brick. Another found a discarded bayonet. The fort was silent. The formal restoration of the Union flag took place on April 14, 1865. It was a calculated act of reconciliation. Major Robert Anderson, now a brevet major general, was invited to raise the same flag he had lowered 4 years earlier. He was 60 years old and in poor health. He stood on a platform built on the rubble. The crowd included both Union officers and former Confederates who had taken an oath of loyalty. At exactly 12 noon, the flag was hoisted. The ropes were stiff. The flag caught the wind. The crowd cheered. Bands played the Star-Spangled Banner. It was a moment of triumph. But that night, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box at Ford's Theater. Lincoln was shot. He died the next morning. The news reached Charleston the following day. The celebration was replaced by mourning. Anderson wrote later that the joy had turned to ashes. The flag that had been raised was lowered to half-staff. The president who had insisted on holding the fort was dead. The second founding of the nation would be led by Andrew Johnson, a man less committed to Reconstruction. In the years after the war, Fort Sumter was slowly rebuilt. The Army Corps of Engineers poured concrete inside the old brick shell. The fort was modernized with new cannon mounts. It was garrisoned again during the Spanish-American War and World War I, but its strategic importance diminished. In 1924, the fort was declared a national monument. In 1948, it was transferred to the National Park Service. Today, it is one of the most visited Civil War sites in the country. Visitors take a ferry from Charleston. The ride takes 30 minutes. The harbor is the same, the skyline has changed. The fort looks peaceful, the grass is green. The cannon are silent, but the scars remain. The walls still show the impact of hundreds of shells. The bricks are pitted. The angles are worn. The park rangers give tour. They explain the sequence of events. They tell the story of the garrison. They show the flagpole where the first flag was raised. They do not try to simplify the history. The site remains politically charged. The debate over the Confederate flag and the meaning of the war continues to evolve. The fall of Fort Sumter is not just a historical event. It is a case study in how systems fail. The political system failed because the two sides could not find a middle ground. The military system failed because the men in charge were not trained for this kind of crisis. The communication system failed because messages were delayed and misinterpreted. The human system failed because leaders on both sides were unwilling to admit they were wrong. The question of who fired the first shot is still debated. Some say it was the Confederates. Others say the Union provoked the attack by refusing to leave. But the answer does not matter as much as the pattern. The pattern is that when fear and pride override reason, war becomes inevitable. The human consequences of that failure are written in the names of the dead. Over 600,000 soldiers died in the Civil War. Many more were wounded. The economic cost was staggering. The social cost included the end of slavery, but also the bitterness of Reconstruction. The wounds of the war did not heal for a century. Some argue they have never fully healed. Fort Sumter still stands as a reminder. It is a pile of bricks that was once a fort. It is a monument to a war that ended slavery, but also to a conflict that nearly destroyed the nation. The lesson is that peace is fragile. It requires constant work. It requires leaders who are willing to compromise. It requires citizens who are willing to listen. When those things fail, the cannons begin to fire. And once they fire, it is almost impossible to stop them. The first shot at Fort Sumter was fired at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861. It was a single mortar round. It arced over the harbor and exploded inside the fort. It was not the loudest sound ever heard, but it was the sound of a nation breaking apart. And it still echoes, and it still echoes. At 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, the first mortar round fired from Fort Johnson. The shell traced an arc over the dark harbor. It was a 10-inch mortar designed to fire high and drop straight down. The explosion inside Fort Sumter was a dull thunder. The sound was heard in Charleston. People rushed to roofs and windows. They could see the flash, then the echo rolling off the water. That single round was the signal for the entire Confederate line to open fire. Within seconds, the rest of the batteries followed. Fort Moultrie opened with 6 guns. Cummings Point added its column-beads. The ironclad floating battery added its weight. The entire harbor turned into a line of fire. The sky lit up in intermittent flashes. The sound was continuous, a rolling roar that did not stop. Inside Fort Sumter, Major Anderson and his men had been waiting for days. They knew the attack was coming. They had only 40 guns mounted, but the fort was a target, not an offensive weapon. The gunners were ordered to conserve ammunition. Anderson did not allow them to return fire immediately. He wanted to wait for daylight. The first hours of the bombardment were one-sided. The Confederate shells slammed into the brick walls. The fort's masonry was designed to withstand direct fire from the old wooden warships. Against a 10-inch mortar shell dropped from a steep angle, the walls held but shook violently. The interior was open. The shells that came over the walls fell inside the parade ground. They exploded near the barracks, the storehouses, the officers' quarters. The wooden roofs caught fire. Anderson ordered the removal of the powder to the lower casemates, where the damp brick might protect it. By 7 a.m., the sun had risen. The smoke from the guns drifted across the harbor. Anderson ordered the fort to return fire. The first Union shot was fired from a 42-pounder cannon in the second tier. It was aimed at Fort Moultrie. The crew had no experience with live fire against a fort, but they loaded and fired. The ball struck the sandbanks in front of Moultrie. The Confederate gunners cheered and then fired again. The duel went on. The rhythm of the bombardment was steady. Every 15 seconds, a Confederate gun fired. The Union guns fired less frequently because of limited ammunition. By mid-morning, the fort's flagstaff was hit. The flag fell. For a few minutes, it looked like the fort had struck its colors. But a lieutenant, Norman J. Hall, ran out and re-rigged the flag. The Confederates saw it rise again. More fire came in. The barracks caught fire and burned. The casemates filled with smoke. The men had to wear wet handkerchiefs to breathe. The heat was intense. The iron doors of the magazines glowed red. A direct hit on the magazine would have ended the whole action. At 1 p.m., the fire reached the barracks. The men had to abandon the upper casemates and crowd into the lower ones. The fort was burning. The powder magazine was only a few feet from the fire. Anderson ordered the men to pass buckets of water in a chain to cool the door. They did this for hours under fire. One man later said he could feel the deck vibrating from every hit. The water in the harbor rose in small waves from the concussion. Throughout the day, there were no direct casualties from the enemy fire, but the strain was enormous. One Union soldier had his hand crushed by a falling brick. Another was knocked unconscious by a shell fragment. By nightfall, the fort was a ruin. The walls were pockmarked. The interior was wrecked. The men had not eaten a full meal. They had no sleep. The firing continued through the night. The Confederates used hot shot, cannonballs heated in furnaces, to start fires. The Union crews had to keep watch. By 1:30 a.m. on April 13th, the fire inside the fort was out of control. The main gate was burnt. The wooden staircases collapsed. The men huddled in the only casemates still habitable. At dawn, the bombardment resumed with even greater intensity. The Confederate batteries had not taken any damage. The Union guns were running low on powder. Anderson knew he could not hold out much longer. He had hoped for reinforcements, but none came. The ships visible outside the harbor were the relief expedition, but they could not penetrate the fire. At 12:20 p.m. on April 13th, a single shot hit the flagstaff again. The flag fell. It was immediately again rehoisted, but the strain was too much. Anderson sent a message to Major Beauregard offering to evacuate if the fort was not reduced. Beauregard's aides, James Chestnut and Stephen D. Lee, returned with a question: would Anderson surrender? Anderson asked for terms. They agreed on an evacuation with honors. The soldiers would march out with their arms, colors, and personal property. The garrison would salute the flag before lowering it. At 2 p.m. on April 13th, the firing ceased. The silence was startling. The smoke drifted away. The harbor was calm. Inside the fort, Anderson ordered a 100-gun salute to the flag. After the 50th round, an accidental explosion killed one man, Private Daniel Ho, and mortally wounded another, Private George Field. The salute was stopped. The flag was lowered and folded. Anderson and his men marched out onto a wharf. They were taken aboard a steamer for transfer to the relief ships. As they left, the Confederate soldiers moved into the fort. A new flag was raised. The surrender was complete. The human toll of the bombardment: one dead, one mortally wounded, no others killed. On the Confederate side, there were no casualties, but the symbolic toll was infinite. The Union had lost the fort. The nation had lost the peace. Anderson's men were taken to New York, where they were greeted as heroes, but Anderson himself wept during the surrender. He wrote later that he had done his best, but his best was not enough. The investigation into the events leading to the fall of Fort Sumter began almost immediately. In Washington, a commission was formed to examine the decisions of the Buchanan administration. The question was, why was the fort not reinforced earlier? Why was the Star of the West repulsed without a fight? Why did Anderson fail to secure the harbor approaches? The answers pointed to confusion, hesitation, and a failure of will. The North blamed Buchanan. The South blamed Lincoln's insistence on holding the fort. The truth was that no one had wanted war, but no one had found a way to stop it. The lessons of Fort Sumter are still studied in military academies. The first lesson is that a symbolic victory can provoke a larger war. The Confederates won the fort, but they lost the border states. The second lesson is that fixed fortifications are vulnerable to siege. Sumter was a fortress, but it could not protect itself against land-based artillery. The third lesson is that communication is critical. If Anderson had received clear orders earlier, he might have acted differently. If Washington had known his situation accurately, they might have sent relief earlier. The event still matters because it was the moment when the unthinkable became real. The nation had argued for decades. Compromises had been made, but on that April morning, the debate ended. The next 4 years would be a cost greater than anyone imagined. Fort Sumter stands as the point of no return. The first shot did not cause the war. It ended the illusion that war could be avoided, and that illusion was the last thing to fall.